Dawn had barely broken through the storm clouds over the Norwegian Sea on April 8th, 1940, when Lieutenant Commander Gerard Roope spotted the dark silhouette emerging from the mist ahead. For a moment, just a heartbeat, he might have hoped it was one of their own. But as the shape materialized through the driving snow and spray, the distinctive profile of a German warship became unmistakable. Not just any warship. This was the Admiral Hipper, a heavy cruiser displacing over 14,000 tons, armed with 8 8-inch guns. Roope's HMS Glowworm, a G-class destroyer, barely 1/10 that size, suddenly seemed impossibly small against the gray morning sea. The Glowworm had already been fighting for her life that morning. What had started as a rescue mission for a man overboard had turned into something far more dangerous. Separated from the battlecruiser HMS Renown and the rest of the British force, headed for Norwegian waters, the lone destroyer had stumbled into the outer screen of a major German naval operation, the invasion of Norway itself, though Roope couldn't have known that in those crucial moments. Just 30 minutes earlier, the Glowworm had encountered and engaged 2 German destroyers emerging from the pre-dawn darkness. The British destroyer's 4.7-inch guns had barked defiance across the churning seas, sending the German destroyers retreating into the mist, calling for help. That call had been answered by something far more formidable than anyone aboard the Glowworm could have anticipated. The Admiral Hipper represented everything the German Kriegsmarine had learned about naval warfare since the First World War. Launched in 1937, she was one of 5 Admiral Hipper-class heavy cruisers, the pride of Germany's resurgent naval power. Her main armament could hurl 270-pound shells over 17 miles. Her armor belt, 4 inches thick at its strongest point, was designed to shrug off destroyer-weight shellfire. She could make 32 knots in ideal conditions, nearly matching the Glowworm's best speed. In every measurable category of naval combat, she outclassed the British destroyer by an order of magnitude. If you're finding this story of David versus Goliath naval combat compelling, consider hitting that like button and subscribing to the Old Breed channel. We bring you these incredible, forgotten stories of military courage every week. Gerard Broadmead Roope had been in the Royal Navy since 1923, when he joined as a 13-year-old cadet. Now at 34, he commanded 145 men aboard a ship that was never meant to fight alone against capital ships. The Glowworm herself was barely 5 years old, commissioned in January 1935 as part of Britain's interwar naval expansion. At just over 300 feet long and displacing 1,400 tons, she was built for fleet escort duty, submarine hunting, and destroyer versus destroyer actions, not for standing toe-to-toe with heavy cruisers. The morning's weather had been typically foul for the Norwegian Sea in early April. Force 6 winds whipped the surface into 15-foot swells. Visibility dropped to less than 5 miles in the snow squalls that swept across the battlefield. Ice formed on every exposed surface, adding dangerous weight to the superstructure. These conditions might have offered some hope of escape for a smaller vessel, but Captain Helmuth High of the Admiral Hipper was too experienced to let his quarry slip away. At 7:59 that morning, the Hipper's main guns opened fire. The first salvo straddled the Glowworm, sending towers of water higher than her mainmast. Roope immediately ordered smoke screens and began violent, evasive maneuvers, throwing his ship into radical turns that sent green water crashing over her bow. The destroyer's guns swung toward the massive adversary, but everyone aboard knew the terrible mathematics of this encounter. The Glowworm's 4.7-inch shells might, at best, damage the Hipper's superstructure, or knock out secondary systems. They couldn't penetrate her vital areas. The radio room aboard the Glowworm crackled with activity as the operator transmitted their position and the enemy contact report. Somewhere over the horizon, the Renown and her escorts received word that the Glowworm had found the enemy. But they were hours away, far too distant to influence what would happen in the next 30 minutes. For 10 minutes, the unequal duel continued. The Hipper's 8-inch shells screamed through the air, each one capable of tearing the Glowworm in half with a direct hit. The destroyer's smokescreen, thick and black, poured from her funnels and smoke generators, creating a protective shroud that drifted across the battlefield. But smoke could only do so much. The German cruiser had radar-assisted fire control, and her experienced gunnery officers walked their salvos closer with each exchange. At 8:10, a shell from the Hipper found its mark. The explosion tore through the Glowworm's forward superstructure, wrecking her fire control systems and killing several men instantly. Fires erupted along her deck. Another hit followed moments later, this one destroying her radio antenna and silencing her desperate transmissions. The destroyer was now alone, burning, and unable to coordinate her defense or call for help. Lieutenant Commander Roope must have understood his position perfectly. Military logic dictated surrender or flight. His ship was crippled, outgunned, and already taking casualties. No court-martial would have faulted him for striking his colors or attempting to disengage under cover of smoke. The Glowworm had already done more than duty required, having engaged enemy forces and transmitted their position before being silenced. But something in Gerard Roope's character refused the logical choice. Perhaps it was his 17 years of naval service, or the tradition of the Royal Navy that stretched back to Drake and Nelson. Perhaps it was the knowledge that the Hipper was heading somewhere important, part of some larger German operation that needed to be delayed, disrupted, or at least bloodied. Or perhaps, in that moment of crisis with his ship burning around him, Roope simply decided that if the Glowworm was going to die, she would die with her teeth in the enemy's throat. The destroyer continued to lay smoke, weaving through her own protective screen while her remaining guns maintained their futile but defiant fire. On the Hipper's bridge, Captain High watched with professional interest as the British destroyer refused to yield. He would later write in his report that he admired the enemy commander's seamanship and courage, even as he methodically worked to destroy him. At approximately 8:24, Roope made a decision that would echo through naval history. With his ship burning, his forward guns destroyed, and his options exhausted, he ordered full speed ahead and turned the Glowworm directly toward the Admiral Hipper. The destroyer burst from her own smokescreen at maximum revolutions, her remaining boiler rooms pushing her to nearly 30 knots, despite the damage she'd sustained. On the Hipper's bridge, the German officers watched in disbelief as the burning destroyer charged straight at them. This wasn't a torpedo run. The angle was wrong, and the Glowworm's torpedo tubes had already been damaged in the fighting. This was something far more primitive and desperate. The British destroyer intended to ram. Captain High ordered hard to starboard and full speed, trying to avoid the collision while bringing his secondary armament to bear. The Hipper's 5.9-inch guns and smaller weapons opened up with everything they had, creating a wall of steel and fire between the two ships. The range closed rapidly, 1,000 yards, 800, 500. Shells tore into the Glowworm continuously now, each hit sending sheets of flame and debris into the storm-tossed morning. The destroyer's bridge was a chaos of smoke, flames, and desperate activity. Roope, wounded but still commanding, held his course with iron determination. The men in the engine rooms, unable to see what was happening above, kept the boilers at maximum pressure, despite the shells penetrating the hull around them. On deck, damage control parties fought fires even as machine gun fire from the Hipper swept their positions. At 300 yards, it became clear that High's evasive maneuver wouldn't be enough. The Glowworm, despite her wounds, had too much momentum and was too close. The destroyer's bow, reinforced for exactly this sort of desperate action, aimed for the Hipper's starboard side just aft of her forward turrets. The impact, when it came at 8:32, was catastrophic. The Glowworm struck the Admiral Hipper at nearly full speed, her bow crumpling as it bit deep into the cruiser's armored belt. The force of the collision, a 1,400-ton destroyer traveling at 30 knots meeting a 14,000-ton cruiser, generated enormous kinetic energy. The Hipper heeled over from the impact, her starboard side crushed inward. But physics favored the larger ship. The Glowworm, her bow destroyed by the collision, scraped along the Hipper's side, tearing away 130 feet of the cruiser's armored belt and destroying her starboard torpedo tubes. The destroyer's forward momentum carried her past the German ship, but she was mortally wounded. Her bow was gone, water pouring into her forward compartments with unstoppable force. As the two ships separated, the Glowworm began to roll. On the Hipper, damage control parties rushed to assess the incredible damage to their starboard side. Armor plates had been ripped away like paper. The torpedo tubes were destroyed, their ready ammunition scattered across the deck. Water poured through buckled seams, though the cruiser's superior compartmentalization prevented catastrophic flooding. The British destroyer was dying. She rolled further to starboard, her deck tilting at an impossible angle. Lieutenant Commander Roope, somehow still alive despite the carnage on the bridge, gave his final order: abandon ship. The crew, those who could still move, began throwing life rafts overboard and jumping into the frigid Norwegian Sea. At 8:38, just 6 minutes after the ramming, HMS Glowworm capsized completely. For a moment, her keel showed above the waves, a final defiant gesture to the morning sky. Then, with a rushing sound audible even over the storm, she slipped beneath the surface. Of her complement of 145 men, only 38 would survive the combination of combat, collision, and the lethal cold of the North Atlantic. Captain High, observing from the Hipper's damaged bridge, did something remarkable. Despite his own ship's wounds, despite being in hostile waters, with a critical mission to complete, he ordered his crew to rescue the British survivors. German sailors threw lines and life rings to men struggling in the oil-covered water. The rescue effort was complicated by the sea state and the Hipper's damage, but the Germans pulled 37 British sailors from the water. One more would be rescued later by a Norwegian vessel. Lieutenant Commander Gerard Roope was seen in the water after the sinking, helping wounded men reach the German rescue lines. Survivors reported that he pushed several men toward safety, refusing assistance himself until others were saved. When a rope was finally thrown to him from the Hipper, Roope grabbed it and began to be pulled up the cruiser's side. But his strength, after the battle and the struggle in the freezing water, finally failed. His hands, numbed by cold and possibly wounded, couldn't maintain their grip. He fell back into the sea and disappeared. His body was never recovered. The Admiral Hipper, nursing her wounds, continued with her mission to invade Norway. The damage from the Glowworm's ramming would require significant repairs, taking the heavy cruiser out of action for several crucial weeks during the Norwegian campaign. The starboard side armor would need complete replacement. The destroyed torpedo tubes would have to be rebuilt, and the hull's structural integrity required extensive work. But perhaps the most extraordinary aftermath of the battle came from Captain Helmuth High himself. The German officer, a professional naval man who'd served since the First World War, was so impressed by Roope's courage and determination that he did something unprecedented. Through the International Red Cross, after the British survivors had been landed as prisoners of war, High sent a message to the British Admiralty. In it, he described the battle and specifically recommended that Lieutenant Commander Gerard Roope be awarded the Victoria Cross, Britain's highest decoration for valor. This recommendation from an enemy officer was extraordinary. The Victoria Cross had been instituted by Queen Victoria in 1856, and in its long history, it had never been awarded on the recommendation of an enemy commander. The citation would eventually read that Roope had displayed valor in action with the enemy of the highest order, specifically noting that his ramming attack against overwhelming odds exemplified the finest traditions of the Royal Navy. The tactical impact of the Glowworm's sacrifice extended beyond the damage to the Admiral Hipper. The destroyer's contact report, transmitted before her radio was destroyed, had alerted the British Admiralty to the presence of major German naval units off Norway. This intelligence, though it came too late to prevent the German invasion, contributed to the Royal Navy's response and the subsequent First and Second Battles of Narvik, where significant German naval losses would eventually occur. The 37 survivors rescued by the Germans spent the remainder of the war in prisoner-of-war camps. Their testimony, provided after liberation in 1945, would confirm the details of their commander's heroism and the remarkable chivalry shown by Captain High and his crew. Several survivors specifically noted that they were treated with respect and provided medical care despite the Hipper's own casualties and damage. The technical details of the ramming itself became a subject of study in naval colleges. The Glowworm had achieved something that seemed impossible. A destroyer, through ramming alone, had inflicted serious damage on a ship 10 times her displacement. The key factors were speed, angle of impact, and the sacrifice of hitting at a point where the destroyer's momentum could overcome the cruiser's armor. The 130 feet of armored belt torn away represented a strip of 4-inch armor plating that should have been impervious to anything the Glowworm could throw at it. In the broader context of the Second World War's naval campaigns, the action between Glowworm and Admiral Hipper stood as a testament to the importance of individual command decisions in warfare. Roope's choice to ram rather than surrender or flee wasn't part of any grand strategy. It wasn't ordered by the Admiralty or suggested by tactical doctrine. It was the decision of one man in command of one small ship who chose to strike a blow against the enemy even at the cost of his ship and his life. The German invasion of Norway, Operation Weser-Übung, proceeded despite the Glowworm's sacrifice. German forces successfully occupied key Norwegian ports and airfields, though at a higher cost in naval units than they'd anticipated. The Admiral Hipper would go on to serve throughout the war, participating in operations against Allied convoys and the Battle of the Barents Sea, but she would never forget the morning a British destroyer tore into her side. The story of the Glowworm also highlighted the complex nature of naval warfare in the Second World War's early months. This was still a time when certain codes of conduct from an earlier era persisted. Captain High's rescue of British survivors and his recommendation for Roope's Victoria Cross reflected a professional respect between naval officers that would become increasingly rare as the war progressed and became more total in its brutality. For the Royal Navy, the loss of the Glowworm was one of many destroyer losses in the war's early years, but the manner of her loss became legendary. Destroyers, by their nature, were expendable assets designed to protect larger ships and engage similar or smaller vessels. But Roope had demonstrated that even the smallest warship commanded with determination and courage, could strike at capital ships when the moment demanded it. The technical evolution of destroyer tactics would be influenced by actions like the glowworms. While ramming remained an absolute last resort, the principle of aggressive, close-range engagement by destroyers against larger ships would be validated repeatedly throughout the Pacific War, where American destroyers would charge Japanese battleships and cruisers in actions like the Battle off Samar. Lieutenant Commander Roope's Victoria Cross was officially awarded on July 6, 1945, after the war's end, when the full story could be verified through survivor testimony and German records. His widow, Honor Roope, received the medal from King George VI at Buckingham Palace. She would later donate it to the Imperial War Museum, where it remains on display as a testament to her husband's extraordinary courage. The citation for the Victoria Cross specifically noted that Roope's action was undertaken in full knowledge of the overwhelming odds against him, and that his ramming attack inflicted serious damage on the enemy vessel. The language, formal and understated in the British tradition, barely captured the desperate heroism of those final minutes. Captain Helmuth High survived the war and lived until 1970. In post-war interviews, he maintained that recommending Roope for the Victoria Cross was simply acknowledging what he'd witnessed, an act of valor that transcended nationality or uniform. His gesture became one of the war's most famous examples of chivalry between enemies, a reminder that even in total war, individual honor could survive. The wreck of HMS Glowworm has never been located. She lies somewhere in the Norwegian Sea, in waters over 1,000 feet deep, her exact position unknown. The 38 survivors have all since passed away, the last dying in 2009. But their testimony, preserved in naval archives and war museums, ensures that the story of their ship's last battle remains part of the historical record. Naval historians have calculated that the kinetic energy of the ramming impact was equivalent to approximately 120 tons of TNT, a destroyer becoming, in essence, a guided missile decades before such weapons existed. The damage to the Admiral Hipper's hull required over 2,000 tons of steel to repair, and the work kept one of Germany's most powerful surface units out of action during critical weeks of the Norwegian campaign. The psychological impact of the glowworm's action resonated through both navies. For the Royal Navy, it became a touchstone example of the fighting spirit expected from destroyer commanders. Aggressive, determined, willing to close with the enemy regardless of odds. For the Kriegsmarine, it served as a warning that British destroyers, even when caught alone and outgunned, remained dangerous adversaries capable of inflicting serious damage. In the immediate aftermath of the ramming, as the glowworm sank and her survivors struggled in the oil-covered water, the war continued around them. The German invasion fleet proceeded to its objectives. British forces, alerted by the glowworm's contact report, began to respond. The Battle of Norway would rage for 2 months, ultimately resulting in German victory, but at a cost that would influence Hitler's later decision not to attempt an invasion of Britain. The technical lessons learned from the engagement influenced destroyer design and tactics for the remainder of the war. The importance of reinforced bows for ramming attacks was validated, though the tactic remained one of absolute desperation. The vulnerability of even heavily armored ships to kinetic impacts at their waterline was noted by naval architects, influencing protective schemes in later designs. The human dimension of the battle, 107 men lost with their ship, represented the cruel arithmetic of naval warfare. These were regular sailors, volunteers, and conscripts who'd found themselves in an impossible situation and had followed their commander's orders to the end. Their sacrifice, while tactically significant in damaging the Admiral Hipper, was part of the larger tragedy of a war that would claim millions of lives. Modern naval doctrine still studies the glowworm action as an example of asymmetric naval warfare, how a smaller, weaker force can still inflict significant damage on a superior enemy through determination and tactical surprise. The ramming attack, while almost never viable in modern naval combat, with its long-range missiles and automated defense systems, represents the underlying principle that aggressive action, even against overwhelming odds, can sometimes achieve disproportionate results. The story of HMS Glowworm and Lieutenant Commander Gerard Roope remains one of the Second World War's most compelling naval actions, not because of its strategic importance. The German invasion of Norway succeeded, despite the destroyer's sacrifice, but because it crystallized the essence of naval courage. A single destroyer, already burning and crippled, turned toward rather than away from a superior enemy and struck the only blow left available to her. In naval tradition, a ship that goes down fighting is said to go down with colors flying. The Glowworm had no time for such formalities in her final moments. Her battle ensign was probably already burned away by the fires consuming her superstructure. But in the most meaningful sense, she exemplified that tradition, defiant to the last, striking at the enemy even as she sank. The legacy of April 8, 1940, lives on in the Royal Navy's training and tradition. Young officers learn about Roope's decision as an example of command responsibility and moral courage. The question implicitly asked in naval colleges remains, faced with similar circumstances, would you have the courage to make the same choice? If you found this story of extraordinary naval courage compelling, please share it with someone who appreciates military history. Subscribe to the Old Breed channel for more forgotten stories of valor from military history, and let us know in the comments, did you know about Lieutenant Commander Roope's posthumous Victoria Cross being recommended by his German opponent? What other examples of chivalry between enemies in World War II have you heard about? The morning of April 8, 1940, began with a man-overboard drill that separated HMS Glowworm from her squadron. It ended with one of naval history's most audacious attacks, a destroyer's bow buried in a heavy cruiser's side, and an act of enemy chivalry that would transcend the hatred of war. In those final moments, as the Glowworm rolled over and sank beneath the storm-tossed waves of the Norwegian Sea, Lieutenant Commander Gerard Roope and his crew wrote their names into the annals of naval valor with their ship's own steel and their own blood. They proved that courage isn't measured in tonnage or gun caliber, but in the willingness to strike at the enemy with whatever weapons remain, even if that weapon is the ship herself.